going south to Costa Rica, where we find a parrot. And we're using a parrot as our subject to talk about painting patterns. And largely, the pattern in this case is what's done in the background. Sometimes animals, including birds, do have an interesting pattern. In this case, though, I'm focusing more on how to create the background. And I'm starting with a pale wash of yellow, and then I'm going to be working into it with some variations of sap green, adding yellow here, adding blue there. And the goal is to create an interesting sort of abstract representation of the foliage that we see behind the parrot, and to do this in a way that gives us a light feeling, makes it feel like he's on a branch up in the trees with light coming through. And so the whites that we leave are important, and the way that we shape the foliage should be interesting. And using a variety of brush strokes, sometimes the side of the brush, sometimes the tip of the brush, basically trying to create volumes of green that are broken by whites and other spaces around the branches that I plan on putting with some dry brush, and around the parrot itself. One thing to think about when making patterns is to understand the shape that you're repeating. In this case, the shape of leaves or bunches of leaves. And each tree is going to have, if you look at trees, they all grow in a different manner, and they present different patterns. So it's important to kind of look at the subject and look at the pattern or look at the shape that you're going to be repeating. In this case, the leaves are broad and hanging down, and the groups of leaves are broken by spaces of seeing the sky through the bunches. They're broken by branches, and they're broken by light. So I'm trying to create a feeling of light moving through these leaves. And I'm also conscious of the fact that I want to show off the parrot in the best possible way. And what does that mean? Letting those breaks in the foliage occur at key points. So I'm going to be using a little bit of a lighter passage behind the tail feathers, the lower tail feathers, a little bit by the parrot's left-hand shoulder. And I'm going to be using a more shadowed version of that pattern behind the head, where we'll get a stronger recognition of the face of the parrot, and behind some other points that can remain a little more obscure. And so that is to say that, we structure the pattern as well. We do create a feeling of randomness, and we do that by varying the size, varying the spacing, varying the touches that we use. But we also organize it. We try to organize it to make the most effective use of the background. In other words, to reveal our parrot in an interesting way. So this is a complicated aspect in painting. It's not obvious how to do this. And I find with a painting that it reveals itself as it's being painted. In other words, if I try to copy the image or the motif too closely, it almost never comes out. It really is more successful when I'm evoking the pattern as the painting progresses. I've moved on now, and I'm working on the branch now with some browns and grays, and evolving the color that's in the parrot. This is right from the tube. It's cadmium orange red, right from the tube with very little water added, because I want that bright red to remain. I don't want it to fade away. I'm also using a lot of dry brush to maintain some whites in the paper, and combining that, it's combined with a rough texture in the paper, which allows the brush to skip along and leave little unpainted segments. And in the end, this has a strong contribution to the painting. It ends up feeling like the light is sort of glinting off certain areas and very bright in certain areas. So I do this often in my work, which is to leave bits of the white paper. If you have a look at the branch, for example, I used a simple dry brush stroke to create the branch, but I've left a lot of the white paper, and there's always the possibility of subduing that if necessary, but I'm liking it the way it is now, and so I see no reason to go back in and add color. The wings were what's called a verditer blue that's made by Holbein. A little opaque, but it really does the trick in this subject. And I'm using the Cad Orange Red by Holbein to create these long tail feathers as well. And if you watch, I'm using as simple a brush stroke as I can manage. I'm not building it up with small touches, but rather trying to express those tail feathers and other parts of the parrot with uninterrupted strokes. There's a power to that stroke, and we find it in Chinese calligraphy or Japanese calligraphy or sumi painting, black ink painting, where the stroke is king. The artist is rendering the subject with very simple strokes, and there's a power created in that, a power in the expression that comes out of the brush. And so we can utilize that in some of our subjects. Very often I try to envision where it would be effective in my motif, and with the parrot it's not hard to see with those long tail feathers or some other parts of the wings that a simple long stroke, or in the branch a very simple dry brush stroke, is quite effective in bringing to life this painting of the parrot. It's starting to assume a finished quality, so I've switched to a smaller brush and I'm moving back into some the broader areas, some of the raw areas, and just adding definitive marks that will be a shadow or an edge, and trying to bring this painting to a conclusion as simply and as gracefully as I can. Where I want a little more focus, I'll go back. I'll add a little stronger color, such as in that green space behind the head. I want that pale milky white of the face to show out, to really appear. So putting a dark behind it is the simplest way to do that. We can do that by repeating that green again with a little darker version behind the head, or a little focal point on that distant branch, or a leaf appearing at the edge of a clump of leaves is another good way to do that. So you can see that the painting has an abstract quality in the background and is definitely inspired by the image we saw at the beginning of the video. But there's a big departure too in the painting of it. The departure being not to focus or not to replicate what we see, but to try to bring up the essence of what we see. And usually something stronger remains. It's stronger, I feel, than the photograph because it invokes the imagination. And it's very much an example of less is more. So here's the finished piece after it's dried. And you can see how the pattern is important to the painting.